Shocking twist in the wedding murder mystery. Who's behind the death? Hook. What happens when a wedding becomes a deadly trap? Secrets, lies, and dark forces come to light in a chilling tale of betrayal and terror. But can the bride escape the nightmare in time, or is she already doomed? Stay with us to uncover the shocking truth that no one saw coming. The church was filled with whispers. The air was thick with tension. The wedding was supposed to be perfect. The bride, radiant in white, smiled nervously at her groom. But something was wrong. The guests felt it. It wasn't just the cold, sharp draft cutting through the high stone walls. It wasn't the dim lighting casting strange shadows across the room. It was something deeper, something unsettling. The sound of footsteps echoed through the aisles. Too slow, too deliberate. The groom's hand trembled. The bride's face paled. The priest's voice faltered. He tried to hide it, but his eyes were darting nervously around the room. Then a gasp, a shrill, terrified breath, a loud thud. Everyone turned toward the source of the noise. In the back of the room, near the entrance, something was off. A figure lay on the floor, still, silent. The guests froze. A man, dressed in black, stood motionless, eyes wide, staring at the body. The groom stepped forward. His voice cracked. "Is he—" The figure in black didn't answer. He just stared. The bride clutched her bouquet. Her hands shook violently. A scream tore through the room. The body on the floor was lifeless. But there was something wrong with it. The blood. It pooled around the neck, dark and thick. The skin was pale, almost as if drained of life. A chill ran down the bride's spine. She turned to look at her groom. His face was twisted in shock, but his eyes, they seemed empty, cold. A second later, the figure in black rushed forward. He pulled the body upright. A chilling whisper escaped his lips. "It's him." Everyone stared in horror. The groom's name, but how? The bride's breath quickened. Her heart pounded in her chest. The air was thick with panic. Her mind raced. The groom, was he hiding something? Could it be true? Could he be behind this? The guests began to murmur. The room grew heavy with suspicion. The priest backed away, fear in his eyes. Suddenly, the doors slammed shut. A lock clicked. The guests were trapped. A scream echoed from the back. Someone was running. Footsteps. Too many. The room fell silent again. The groom was gone. Vanished. The only thing left was the body, and the unsettling feeling of something far darker lurking in the shadows. The air grew colder. The room darker. A sense of dread wrapped around everyone like a heavy cloak. The bride stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the spot where her groom had just been. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The priest, trembling, made his way to the body. He knelt beside it, examining the lifeless form. His hands shook as he reached for the man's neck. A gasp escaped his lips. There was no pulse. But the strangest thing was the bruise. A deep, dark imprint on the neck, like fingers had tightened around it. Someone strangled him, the priest whispered, voice barely audible. A sharp intake of breath. The figure in black stepped forward again. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room. He was tall, imposing, and unsettlingly calm. "You all need to stay calm," he said, though his voice did nothing to ease the growing fear. The guests were paralyzed, their eyes darting from one another, unsure who to trust. The figure in black turned to the bride. "Do you know who did this?" he asked quietly. Her throat tightened. She shook her head. The silence was suffocating. No one knew what to say. The wedding guests were now prisoners in this church. The doors had been locked. The windows too high, too small to escape through. The only way out was through the truth. But who could be trusted? A sharp cry echoed from the back of the church. A woman had collapsed, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. It was the bride's sister. She had been standing near the altar, watching. Now, she was on the floor, trembling. The figure in black moved quickly to her side. He knelt, examining her. "Poison," he muttered. "She's been poisoned." The bride's eyes widened. She staggered backward. "Poison? How? Who?" And then, like a slap to the face, the realization hit her. Her groom, gone, dead. The mystery deepened. Who was behind it? What did they want? And more terrifying, how far would they go to get it? The room seemed to close in around her. The air was thick with fear. The guests stood frozen, eyes wide, breath shallow. The bride's mind raced. Her sister poisoned. Her groom murdered. And still no answers. The figure in black stood, his expression unreadable. He turned to face the bride. "There's something you need to know," he said quietly. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. "What is it?" She whispered, her voice shaking. His gaze hardened. "You were never meant to marry him." Her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, barely able to form the words. The figure in black stepped closer, his presence imposing. Shocking twist in the wedding murder mystery. Who's behind the death? Hook. What happens when a wedding becomes a deadly trap? Secrets, lies, and dark forces come to light in a chilling tale of betrayal and terror. But can the bride escape the nightmare in time, or is she already doomed? Stay with us to uncover the shocking truth that no one saw coming. The church was filled with whispers. The air was thick with tension. The wedding was supposed to be perfect. The bride, radiant in white, smiled nervously at her groom. But something was wrong. The guests felt it. It wasn't just the cold, sharp draft cutting through the high stone walls. It wasn't the dim lighting casting strange shadows across the room. It was something deeper, something unsettling. The sound of footsteps echoed through the aisles. Too slow, too deliberate. The groom's hand trembled. The bride's face paled. The priest's voice faltered. He tried to hide it, but his eyes were darting nervously around the room. Then a gasp, a shrill, terrified breath, a loud thud. Everyone turned toward the source of the noise. In the back of the room, near the entrance, something was off. A figure lay on the floor, still, silent. The guests froze. A man, dressed in black, stood motionless, eyes wide, staring at the body. The groom stepped forward. His voice cracked. "Is he—" The figure in black didn't answer. He just stared. The bride clutched her bouquet. Her hands shook violently. A scream tore through the room. The body on the floor was lifeless. But there was something wrong with it. The blood. It pooled around the neck, dark and thick. The skin was pale, almost as if drained of life. A chill ran down the bride's spine. She turned to look at her groom. His face was twisted in shock, but his eyes, they seemed empty, cold. A second later, the figure in black rushed forward. He pulled the body upright. A chilling whisper escaped his lips. "It's him." Everyone stared in horror. The groom's name, but how? The bride's breath quickened. Her heart pounded in her chest. The air was thick with panic. Her mind raced. The groom, was he hiding something? Could it be true? Could he be behind this? The guests began to murmur. The room grew heavy with suspicion. The priest backed away, fear in his eyes. Suddenly, the doors slammed shut. A lock clicked. The guests were trapped. A scream echoed from the back. Someone was running. Footsteps. Too many. The room fell silent again. The groom was gone. Vanished. The only thing left was the body, and the unsettling feeling of something far darker lurking in the shadows. The air grew colder, the room darker. A sense of dread wrapped around everyone like a heavy cloak. The bride stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the spot where her groom had just been. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The priest, trembling, made his way to the body. He knelt beside it, examining the lifeless form. His hands shook as he reached for the man's neck. A gasp escaped his lips. There was no pulse. But the strangest thing was the bruise. A deep, dark imprint on the neck, like fingers had tightened around it. Someone strangled him, the priest whispered, voice barely audible. A sharp intake of breath. The figure in black stepped forward again. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room. He was tall, imposing, and unsettlingly calm. "You all need to stay calm," he said, though his voice did nothing to ease the growing fear. The guests were paralyzed, their eyes darting from one another, unsure who to trust. The figure in black turned to the bride. "Do you know who did this?" he asked quietly. Her throat tightened. She shook her head. The silence was suffocating. No one knew what to say. The wedding guests were now prisoners in this church. The doors had been locked. The windows too high, too small to escape through. The only way out was through the truth. But who could be trusted? A sharp cry echoed from the back of the church. A woman had collapsed, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. It was the bride's sister. She had been standing near the altar watching. Now, she was on the floor, trembling. The figure in black moved quickly to her side. He knelt, examining her. "Poison," he muttered. "She's been poisoned." The bride's eyes widened. She staggered backward. "Poison? How? Who?" And then, like a slap to the face, the realization hit her. Her groom, gone, dead. The mystery deepened. Who was behind it? What did they want? And more terrifying, how far would they go to get it? The room seemed to close in around her. The air was thick with fear. The guests stood frozen, eyes wide, breath shallow. The bride's mind raced. Her sister poisoned. Her groom murdered. And still no answers. The figure in black stood, his expression unreadable. He turned to face the bride. "There's something you need to know," he said quietly. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice shaking. His gaze hardened. "You were never meant to marry him." Her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, barely able to form the words. The figure in black stepped closer, his presence imposing. "There's a secret," he said. "A dark secret about your fiancé." Her heart pounded. The room felt too small, too tight. The priest, still kneeling beside the body, glanced up nervously. "Is that true?" the bride asked, her voice desperate. "What secret?" The figure hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "Your fiancé wasn't who he claimed to be. He had enemies, dangerous ones." The bride felt the floor beneath her shift, as though the ground itself was unstable. Her mind reeled. "Enemies?" she repeated, trying to make sense of the words. The figure nodded grimly. He owed them a lot of money, and when they came to collect, they found more than they bargained for. Her eyes darted to the lifeless body at the altar. The priest stood up, trembling. "Is it true?" the bride asked him, her voice barely above a whisper. The priest met her gaze, his face pale. "I feared this day would come," he admitted, his voice strained. "He wasn't the man you thought he was. He was mixed up in something dark." The bride's world seemed to crumble around her. Her groom, the man she thought she knew, wasn't who he appeared to be. A shadow of doubt fell over her mind. "Why didn't you warn me?" she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. The priest looked down, guilt written across his face. "I didn't know how," he murmured. Suddenly, a door creaked open behind them. Everyone turned. A new figure appeared in the doorway, tall, imposing, with cold eyes that scanned the room with unsettling calm. The figure in black stiffened. "Who are you?" the bride demanded, her voice trembling. The newcomer stepped forward. "I'm the one who's been watching," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "And now, I think it's time we finish this." The tension in the room thickened. A new wave of fear swept through the guests. The wedding had turned into something far darker, and no one knew who would survive the night. The newcomer's eyes never left the bride. He moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the heavy silence. The figure in black tensed, his posture shifting. "You," the bride whispered. "What do you want?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Everything," he replied softly. The room felt colder. The air seemed to draw in, as if holding its breath. The guests shifted uneasily, none daring to speak. The bride's heart raced in her chest. She glanced at her sister, still trembling on the floor. Her gaze darted back to the figure in black. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Who are all of you?" The man chuckled darkly. "I think you know," he said. "You just don't want to admit it." A sharp sound broke the tension. Another scream. This time, from the back of the church. The priest staggered, clutching his chest. His face contorted in pain, eyes wide with terror. "Father!" the bride cried, rushing to his side. But before she could reach him, the priest collapsed to the floor. The room went silent again. No one moved. The bride's heart pounded harder, the blood rushing in her ears. The figure in black stepped forward, his cold gaze never leaving her. "You're not safe here," he said, his voice low and steady. The bride's breath hitched. "Who did this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who killed him?" The man's lips curled into a grim smile. "Someone who wanted you to know the truth," he said. The bride's head spun. She felt the walls closing in, her pulse thundering in her temples. She glanced around frantically, as if searching for some escape. The air was suffocating. Her eyes locked with the newcomer's once more. "I don't understand," she whispered. He took another step forward. "You don't need to," he said quietly. "You just need to know that everything has been set in motion. The game is over." A cold dread settled over her. Her body went numb. The figure in black moved toward the priest's body, crouching beside it. The newcomer turned toward the rest of the guests, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We've all been waiting," he said, his voice growing colder, "for the truth to come out." And then, in one smooth motion, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, blood-stained envelope. He held it up, letting the guests see it. "This," he said, "is the answer you've all been searching for." A shiver ran through the bride. She couldn't breathe. The mystery was far deeper than she could have imagined. And the truth, she realized with growing horror, was just the beginning. The room seemed to shrink around her. The envelope in the man's hand felt like a ticking bomb. Every eye in the church was fixed on it. The bride's hands trembled, her skin cold and clammy. "Open it," the figure in black demanded, his voice sharp. She didn't move. Her heart hammered in her chest. "What's inside?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The newcomer smiled again, that same cruel, empty smile. "You'll see soon enough." He took a step closer, holding the envelope out to her. The air felt thick, suffocating. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The bride's fingers twitched. Finally, she reached out. Her hands were unsteady as she took the envelope, the weight of it making her feel sick. The guests watched in complete silence. She tore it open, her breath caught in her throat. Inside, there was a single photograph. The image was blurred, but unmistakable. Her groom, alive, smiling, standing next to another woman. Her heart dropped into her stomach. No, this couldn't be right. She felt dizzy, but it was the handwriting on the back that made her blood run cold. It read, asterisk, she didn't know, but you should have, asterisk. The room grew colder, the silence unbearable. The figure in black spoke again, his voice low. The truth is, your groom was never yours to begin with. The bride's head swam with confusion. What do you mean? She whispered, almost to herself. He was a pawn, a tool in a game far bigger than you could imagine. The man in black paused, watching her closely. Your groom was involved in something much darker, something that went deeper than just money or betrayal. She couldn't understand. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she sank to the floor, clutching the photograph to her chest. The figure in black crouched beside her. Do you want to know the real reason he's dead? He asked softly. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. The figure leaned closer. Because he was getting too close to the truth, her mind reeled, but she couldn't grasp it. The photograph shook in her hands. The newcomer stepped forward, his face expressionless. And now, he said, the game is over. You're a part of it now. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Part of what? She gasped, her voice breaking. The man's lips twisted into a cruel grin. Part of the plan. The truth will never set you free. A sudden crash from the back of the church cut through the tension. A figure stumbled into view, her groom, alive, bloodied but alive. The room went still, but something was wrong. His eyes were vacant, empty. He limped toward the altar, as though drawn by some invisible force. The guests backed away, murmurs rising again. The bride's mouth went dry. Her hands shook violently as she rose to her feet. No, this can't be real, she whispered, backing away from him. But the groom's eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, fixed on her. The air crackled with dread. She knew something had changed, and the wedding was no longer the end. It was the beginning of something much worse. The groom's broken figure moved closer, his steps slow and uneven. His once sharp features were now drawn, his face pale, drained of life. The guests recoiled, their faces etched with fear. The bride's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like lead. Her gaze locked with his. The emptiness in his eyes, it was like staring into an abyss. Why are you here? She choked out, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth barely moved as he spoke, his voice hoarse. Help me, he rasped. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind screamed for answers, but there was only more confusion, more terror. The man in black took a step back, his expression unreadable. Don't be fooled, he said, his voice cold. He's not the man you thought he was. The bride's eyes darted back to the groom, then to the figure in black. Who is he? She demanded. What did you do to him? The groom's hand twitched, like he was trying to reach for her, but something was holding him back. The figure in black didn't flinch. He's been changed. Manipulated, he said softly, just like the rest of us. The bride's stomach churned. Changed, she repeated, her mind struggling to comprehend. What do you mean? The man stepped closer, his voice low. Almost a whisper now. Your fiancé, he's a part of something much darker. Something none of us can escape from. Her heart sank. A chill ran through her bones. The groom's body twitched again, his eyes unblinking, staring straight at her. Please, his voice was faint. I don't want this. The words sent a shiver down her spine. The figure in black shook his head slowly. You can't save him, he said. He's already lost. The bride's breath caught in her throat. Her world was unraveling. Why? She asked, tears blurring her vision. Why did you do this? The man in black stepped back again. Because the truth is, you were never meant to marry him. Not truly. The room seemed to spin. Then who? She whispered, her voice trembling. Who am I supposed to trust? The figure's eyes hardened. Trust yourself, he said. And what's left of your fiancé? The air in the church grew colder still, the tension thick enough to cut. The groom's body jerked again, his hand lifting slowly, reaching for the bride. Please help me, his voice cracked. The bride took a step forward, her hand trembling. But something was wrong. Her instinct screamed at her to stop. She hesitated. The figure in black watched her closely. Don't be fooled, he warned. But it was too late. As the bride reached out, the groom's eyes flickered to life, no longer empty, but full of desperation. And then, in a sudden movement, he lunged. A gasp tore through the room. The guests screamed, stumbling backward. But the bride didn't move. She was frozen, staring at him. His hands grasped at her, pulling her closer, his voice frantic. Don't leave me. Don't go. But his touch felt wrong, cold, unnatural. Her heart pounded in her chest, the world blurring around her. She struggled to break free, but his grip was like iron. And then a sound echoed through the church, a low, guttural growl. The figure in black stepped forward quickly. No, he shouted, his voice rising. The groom's eyes snapped to him. There was something darker in them now. The figure in black drew a weapon from his coat, thin and sharp, gleaming in the low light. No, the bride screamed, struggling harder. But it was too late. With a swift motion, the figure in black moved forward, and everything erupted into chaos. The bride's scream echoed, but no one heard it. No one could hear anything anymore. The church, once full of life, now felt like a tomb. And the wedding, once a celebration, had become a nightmare from which there would be no escape. The room was plunged into chaos. The bride, her heart racing, struggled to break free from the groom's vice-like grip. His hands, cold as ice, tightened around her wrists, pulling her closer. Her breath came in shallow gasps, panic rising in her chest. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. The figure in black moved with unnatural speed. His eyes burned with a cold, merciless resolve. Without a word, he reached out and grabbed the groom by the throat. The bride gasped as the figure lifted him effortlessly off the ground, his fingers squeezing tighter, choking the life out of him. The groom's body writhed, his mouth opening and closing in desperate, silent pleas. His eyes flickered wildly, desperate for release. But there was no escape. The figure in black's face remained impassive. With a sudden, brutal twist, he threw the groom to the ground. The guests stood frozen in fear, unable to look away. The groom's body hit the stone floor with a sickening thud. For a moment, the room was still. Then the figure in black stepped back, eyes never leaving the bride. Her heart was hammering in her chest. Her world felt like it was crumbling around her. Why? She gasped, voice trembling. Why did you? The figure's gaze darkened. Because, he said quietly, he was never meant to be with you. He was a pawn in a game far bigger than you could ever understand. Her head spun. She couldn't breathe. What do you mean? She whispered, her voice shaking. The figure in black took a step forward, his presence overwhelming. The truth is, your fiancé was never your choice, he said, his voice low and full of menace. He was chosen for you, and now he's gone. And so are the others. Her mind reeled. No, this can't be, she gasped, her voice barely audible. Don't you see, the figure continued. This whole wedding, this whole life you thought you were going to have, was built on lies, on deceit. He was just a piece in a larger puzzle. The groom's body lay motionless on the floor. Her mind screamed for answers, but she couldn't find them. The weight of everything, the secrets, the lies, the death, crushed her. I didn't ask for this, she whispered. No one does, the figure said coldly. But some things can't be avoided. The guests, still paralyzed by fear, watched in silence as the man in black approached the bride. She backed away, instinctively moving toward the altar, the photo still clutched tightly in her hand. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, tell me what's happening. What's going on?" He stepped closer, his face expressionless. "You're not getting out of here. None of you are," he said, his tone final. "The truth has already been set in motion. The game is in play, and you've already lost." The air seemed to grow heavier, suffocating. And then, without warning, the church doors slammed shut, the sound echoing like thunder. The guests turned, their faces filled with panic. The bride felt the weight of the silence pressing down on her, the realization sinking in. No one was leaving, not until it was over. She turned to the figure in black, desperation in her eyes. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. His cold gaze never left hers. "I want you to understand," he said softly. "There's no escaping what's coming. You're already part of it." The room was suffocating now. Her lungs burned, the air thick and heavy with fear. And in that moment, she understood. This wasn't just about her. It was about something far darker. And there would be no escape for any of them. The tension in the room was unbearable. Every heartbeat felt like a drum pounding in her ears. The guests, now panicked and desperate, moved in a frenzy, eyes darting to the doors, the windows, any possible way out. But there was no way out. The church was a prison. The figure in black stood motionless, his eyes scanning the room with unsettling calm, as if watching a play unfold. The bride's breath hitched. She couldn't stop shaking. You can't do this," she whispered, pleading. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out another photograph. This time it was an image of her, her face terrified, her hands tied, eyes wide in fear. The photograph sent a chill straight through her. "You've been a part of this from the start," the figure said, his voice low, measured. The bride recoiled, her mind struggling to grasp the truth. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No, I didn't know." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "It doesn't matter if you knew. You're caught in the web now." The room felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in on her. Her breath came faster, her chest tight with panic. "What is this? What is happening to me?" she gasped. The figure in black stopped right in front of her. His presence loomed over her like a shadow. "There's no escape," he said quietly. "Not for you. Not for any of them." The groom's body lay motionless on the floor, but something in the stillness fell off. The bride dared not look down. Her focus remained on the man before her, the coldness in his eyes sending a shiver down her spine. Who are you?" she demanded, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. The figure's lips curled into a slow, almost pitying smile. "I told you before, I'm the one who's been watching." "Watching," she repeated, her voice trembling. "Watching me? Watching all of us." He nodded. "Everyone in this room is a part of something. Something bigger than you could ever understand." The words hung in the air like a dark promise. The bride's mind was spinning. She couldn't think straight. The weight of what was happening was suffocating. "Why?" she choked out. "Why us? Why now?" The figure in black didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped to the side and gestured toward the back of the church. The guests were now in full panic mode. Some of them tried to rush to the doors, but the heavy, locked doors wouldn't budge. Others whispered urgently among themselves, eyes wide with fear. It was clear. Everyone was trapped. The figure's eyes shifted back to the bride, his expression darkening. "You don't get it yet, do you?" he said, his voice cutting through the panic. "This is just the beginning. The moment you walked into this church, you sealed your fate. All of you." Her chest tightened as the realization hit her like a wave. The wedding, the ceremony, the guests, the groom, everything had been orchestrated. From the start, she had been chosen for something far darker, and there was no way out. The man in black stepped back, surveying the room once more. Soon you will all understand. Soon you will all know what this is really about. The guests were now desperately trying to break down the doors, clawing at the walls, shouting for help. But the figure remained unfazed. The bride felt her knees buckle. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she clutched the photograph, the edges fraying in her grip. Her mind raced for any hop, but there was nothing. Not anymore. The figure's eyes locked with hers once more. "The truth," he whispered, his voice like ice, always finds its way. And in that moment the bride knew. The nightmare was only just beginning, and there would be no escape. The air was thick with desperation. The bride could feel her heartbeat pounding in her chest, each beat louder than the last. Her hands trembled, clutching the photograph so tightly that the edges cut into her palm. She glanced around, her eyes frantically searching for something, anything to hold on to. The guests were panicking now. Some were on their knees, praying for salvation, while others banged their fists against the doors, screaming for help. But the walls seemed to grow thicker, the air heavier, as though the church itself was closing in on them. The figure in black stood still, watching them all with a detached, cold expression. The groom's body lay lifeless on the floor, but his presence was still felt, haunting the space. "Stop," the bride whispered, barely able to form the words. "Please stop. What do you want from us?" The figure in black's eyes flickered with something unreadable. He stepped toward her slowly, as if savoring the moment. "You still don't understand," he said softly. "You were never meant to be here. You were chosen, and so were they." Her mind reeled. "Chosen?" she repeated, her voice barely audible. "For what?" The figure's lips curved into a slow, cruel smile. "For the truth," he said, his voice dripping with cold certainty. "For the end of everything you thought you knew. This wedding was never about love. It was never about you and him. It was a setup, a ritual, a beginning." The bride's head spun. Her chest tightened. A sharp cry echoed from behind her. She turned, but it was too late. One of the guests had collapsed, her body twitching violently on the cold stone floor. The others around her recoiled in horror as the woman's eyes rolled back in her head, her face twisted in agony. "What's happening?" the bride gasped. The figure in black's voice was cold and final. "The first sacrifice," he said. "The others will follow. There is no escape from this fate. Not for you. Not for anyone." The room seemed to contract around her. The bride's breath became shallow, her vision swimming. The woman's convulsions slowed, her body going limp, but the horror in her eyes remained. The figure turned his attention back to the bride. "You're part of the game now," he said, his voice like ice. "There's no going back. Not for you, not for any of them. Not for anyone who's here." The woman who had collapsed lay still, her eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Her chest barely rose, but her mouth twisted into something like a grin. The figure in black moved closer to the bride, his gaze unyielding. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. The walls felt like they were closing in even tighter. "No," she whispered. "No, I won't be part of this. Please." He leaned in closer, his breath cold against her skin. "You already are," he said softly. "You just haven't realized it yet." The sound of the church doors creaking broke the silence. Everyone turned. The doors, previously locked, had begun to open slowly, a faint creak that echoed through the church like the whisper of some ancient force. The guests stared, fear in their eyes, but no one dared to move toward the door. The figure in black stood still, watching the doors open with a sense of grim satisfaction. "This is it," he murmured. "The end." The air shifted suddenly. A low hum filled the room, a strange, otherworldly sound. It seemed to pulse, vibrating through the floor, the walls, the very air itself. And then silence. The guests were frozen, their faces pale and strained. The bride's mind raced. The truth, the game, the end. The doors were wide open now, but no one moved. Not until the figure in black spoke again. "Go," he commanded, his voice sharp and cold. "The truth awaits outside." The bride's eyes locked on the open doors. She could see the moonlight streaming through the archway, casting long shadows on the ground. Her legs moved of their own accord. She took a hesitant step forward. The figure's cold eyes never left her as she stepped into the open doorway. But the moment her foot crossed the threshold, something shifted. The temperature dropped. The air around her grew thick and suffocating, and the doors slammed shut behind her. The final click of the lock echoed through the night. She was no longer inside, and whatever awaited her outside, it was far worse than she could have ever imagined. The cold outside air hit her like a slap to the face. The bride stumbled into the darkness, the shock of the sudden shift almost too much to bear. Her breath clouded in the freezing night, but it wasn't just the cold. It was the overwhelming weight of what had just happened, the terror that still gripped her chest. The doors behind her, once wide open, now stood solidly closed, locked. The church was sealed off from the world, its ancient walls trapping everything inside. She looked around, her heart racing. The night was eerily quiet, save for the faint rustle of wind through the trees. But the silence felt wrong. It was as though the world itself had held its breath, waiting. She stumbled forward, her mind clouded with confusion and fear. There was nowhere to run, nothing to hide behind. The figure in black had said there was no escape, and for the first time, she truly believed it. But then a sound, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The low hum that had filled the church was now present outside, vibrating through the ground beneath her feet. Her eyes darted around, desperate to find its source. Then she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, tall, thin, shrouded in shadows. A chill ran through her. The figure in black had said the truth awaited her outside. But this wasn't the truth. Not like this. Her heart pounded. It was him. No, something else. Something far darker. The figure took a step forward, and the air seemed to shift again. The ground beneath her felt unstable, like the very earth was shifting under her feet. The figure's face remained hidden in shadow, but she could feel its presence. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It simply moved closer, gliding across the ground with eerie silence, like a predator closing in on its prey. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel the weight of its gaze, and then it spoke. "You've crossed the line," a cold voice said. The words pierced the night air, and she froze. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, the movement smooth and deliberate. "You're a part of this now," it said again. "There's no going back." The bride's pulse quickened, the panic rising in her throat. "I don't understand," she gasped. "What is this? What am I part of?" The figure reached up, pulling back its hood. For the first time, she saw its face, and it was familiar. Her heart stopped. It was the groom, but not the one she knew. This version of him was twisted, a hollow shell of the man she had married. His eyes were empty, dark, void-like. His skin was pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. He smiled at her, but there was no warmth in it, only something darker, something cold. "You're mine now," he whispered. "We all are." The bride took a step back, her legs trembling beneath her. "No, no," she cried, her voice rising in panic. But he stepped forward again, his movements deliberate, like a predator cornering its prey. "You never had a choice," he said. "None of us did." The hum grew louder again, the ground beneath her trembling now. The church behind her, its doors closed tight, felt miles away. The figure smiled again, the dark emptiness in his eyes growing. And the truth, the horrifying truth, began to seep into her consciousness. This wasn't just about her. It was about something far worse. A game, a ritual, a fate she couldn't escape. Her chest tightened as the realization hit her. She was trapped in this nightmare, just like the others, and no one was getting out alive. Not even her, the bride's heart hammered in her chest, each beat like a drum of impending doom. The figure, her groom, but not the man she had known, stepped closer, his cold eyes locked on hers. "Don't," she whispered, taking a step back. Her voice quivered, but there was no escaping him now. "Don't run," he said, his voice low, almost soothing, but there was nothing warm about it. "You're part of it, just like the rest of us." Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees. This wasn't him. This couldn't be him. His face had been twisted, drained of life, as though something had hollowed him out, replacing the man she had once loved with something far darker. "Why?" she gasped, her breath sharp. "Why are you doing this? Why me?" The groom, or whatever he had become, paused. His gaze softened for just a moment, a fleeting glimmer of recognition. "You were never supposed to know," he murmured. "But now you've seen it all. And it's too late." The air felt thick with dread. The wind howled around them, the trees shuddering as if in response to the presence of something ancient, something malevolent. She wanted to scream, to flee, but her legs were frozen in place. "Please," she begged. "Please let me go. I didn't sign up for this." The groom's twisted smile returned, cold and empty. "You never had a choice." The hum in the air grew louder, more insistent. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as if reality itself was warping. Behind him, the dark figure, the one who had watched them all, emerged from the shadows. His cold eyes flickered with amusement, watching the bride's terror. "You're part of a much bigger plan," he said. "A plan that's been in motion long before you even knew his name." The ground cracked, a dark fissure opening at their feet. The sky above seemed to darken, swirling with unnatural clouds, and as the bride looked up, the realization hit her with full force. There was no escape. The game was over. They had all lost, and the nightmare was only beginning. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble, as if the very earth was rejecting what had unfolded. The bride's breath caught in her throat, her entire body numb with fear. She stared at the two figures before her, her groom, or what was left of him, and the dark man who had orchestrated this nightmare from the shadows. It was over. Her heart had known it for some time, but now she felt the weight of it. The endless web of lies, the ritual that had played out beneath her, it was all coming to a cruel, inevitable end. "I don't want this," she whispered, her voice barely a sound. The words felt hollow, powerless. Her groom, the hollow version of him, moved toward her once more, his cold eyes glinting with something ancient, something unfathomable. "It's too late for that," he said softly, his voice not quite his own. "You knew the moment you stepped into this church that nothing was ever going to be the way you thought." The dark figure beside him stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes," the man said, his voice calm, "the truth is not a choice. It is simply something we must face. Accept." The bride's chest tightened. She could feel the weight of their words, the truth they carried with them, the truth that had been buried deep beneath everything, beneath the love, the vows, the hopes for a future.